Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hello, my dear friends. Beneath the shine of pyramids and royal thrones lie secrets that history rarely chooses to reveal. Pharaohs were not just rulers, but also participants in strange intimate rituals that even the gods might have ignored. They united with divine figures, expressed desire openly in public spaces, were linked with the dead, and turned purity into ritual practice. Every act was covered in a sacred meaning. Yet the reality beneath it all was unsettling and deeply raw. Tonight, we will step into a hidden realm of sacred desire that pharaohs kept concealed for centuries. So before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy this content. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to see who is joining from different parts of the world. Now lower the lights, maybe switch on a fan for a calming background sound, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If you have always believed that ancient Egyptian pharaohs ruled with strict discipline and divine purpose, you might want to rethink what truly happened behind the sealed doors of their stone chambers. In the warm glow of the Nile and beneath the massive shadows of ancient temples, the royal bloodline was treated as so sacred that even affection and desire followed strict traditions. But those traditions were far from what most societies accept today. In ancient Egypt, protecting royal purity meant the lines between family and partners were not just blurred, they were intentionally removed. The pharaoh did not only govern with divine authority, he was believed to be a living god, and in Egyptian mythology, gods often married their own siblings. So pharaohs followed the same path. Inside the royal court, marriages between brothers and sisters were official, common, and even honored. A sister as queen was not considered wrong. She was viewed as the most suitable choice for a king who needed to preserve divine lineage. Marrying outside the royal line risked bringing impurity into it. Because of this, the throne often stayed within the same circle of royal sons and daughters generation after generation. A king's daughter could become the wife of her father, or even her brother. The cycle continued with almost no opposition. The people accepted it, the priests approved it, the monuments preserved it. Many modern viewers think such unions were rare or symbolic, but the archaeological evidence suggests they were quite real. Hieroglyphic writings carved into temple walls do not avoid these connections. Instead, they openly describe them. Pharaohs presented their sister wives with full honor and titles. Children born from these unions were celebrated, not hidden. There was no shame because shame had no place in a system that reshaped morality under divine authority. What may seem disturbing today was once viewed as the base of order. It was not only marriages that blurred the lines. Physical closeness between relatives was part of a larger belief system that combined religion with human nature. If Isis could unite with Osiris, then a pharaoh marrying his sister was simply following the divine example. It was seen as devotion, not wrongdoing. Compared to today's world where royal families marry for alliances or love, the Egyptians created their system around sacred repetition. They did not seek alliances, they desired control, and they believed that control began within the private chambers of the palace. Certain sections were reserved only for royal women. Sisters, half-sisters, daughters, and nieces lived together in what was known as the harem, although this word carries meanings from other cultures that do not fully apply here. In the Egyptian context, the royal women were not isolated for protection. They were kept close for a purpose. They were the group from which the next queen would be chosen, and they understood it. Girls of royal blood were raised, knowing that one day they might be called to the pharaoh's side, not only as relatives, but also as wives. There was no need to hide anything. Servants prepared their rooms in the same manner as they would for a royal union. The ceremonies were structured, the bedding rituals guided by priests, and the birth of any child carefully documented. What makes this fascinating is how these young women were both members of royalty and key parts of a controlled lineage system. They shared the same divine lineage as the king, and were expected to unite it with his once again. But such closeness carried effects across generations. This pattern of inbreeding resulted in health issues that became visible, even in statues and carvings found in tombs. Some pharaohs showed physical abnormalities. Others passed away at a young age. The well-known Tutankhamun is often mentioned as a result of this system. His parents were most likely brother and sister. His own health was weak, his bones delicate, and his body showed deformities. Yet none of these dangers were considered enough to stop the tradition. The purity of blood was valued more than the strength of the body, and so the practice continued, not because it worked biologically, but because it fit their beliefs. A pharaoh was not simply a human. He was seen as the living form of a god on earth. He could not marry someone beneath his status, but if everyone else was beneath him, who remained as a match, only someone of equal standing, and that meant someone with the same blood, the same origin, the same identity. At times the pharaoh would have several wives. Among them, the chief queen was usually a sister. Other women could come from noble families, distant lands, or even servant backgrounds, but their children rarely held the same importance. The children of the sister wife were considered the most rightful heirs. Even if they were physically weak or mentally unstable, they carried a higher spiritual position. There are examples where this pattern extended even further into later generations. Daughters born from these unions were sometimes married to the next pharaoh, continuing the cycle. In one disturbing case, there is a theory that a father married both his sister and later his daughter. Such situations were not always written clearly, but the repetition of names and timelines makes it hard to deny. It becomes unclear where loyalty ended and duty began. From the outside, the palaces appeared organized and blessed. But behind the painted walls and decorated courtyards, the inner lives of these royals must have been deeply complicated. Sisters, becoming brides, daughters, being prepared to ran deep bonds with their fathers, brothers growing up alongside those who would later become their wives. In a world where all were dressed in gold and linen, and all worshipped the same gods, what did closeness truly mean? What did love represent? The answer, perhaps, is that those ideas were not the focus. The true aim was not emotional satisfaction. It was about maintaining a cosmic order. To the ancient Egyptians, family lines were like rivers that should never mix with unfamiliar streams. Each union between siblings acted like a barrier built to hold back the uncertainty of the outside. They lived with a fear of chaos, and nothing seemed more chaotic to them than blending divine blood with the ordinary world. The temples strengthened these beliefs. Stories of the gods carved into stone spoke of unions that challenged modern thinking but confirmed sacred harmony. Children in the royal family were raised with these stories. They never questioned them. Why would they? The gods practiced it. The priests supported it. The people accepted it, and the walls preserved it. As night settled over the palace and the hallways grew cooler, another royal woman might be guided through a corridor lit by soft oil lamps. She could step into a chamber already arranged for her, not filled with romance but with responsibility. Linen beds, fragrant oils, and a calm stillness awaited her. She was not only a sister, she was a symbol of continuity. In the next part, we will move deeper into these royal chambers, where the official queen was not always the center of attention, and where real closeness often existed beyond the reach of the crown. Even within the carefully preserved purity of royal bloodlines, relationships followed a different pattern. While the official queen might carry the highest title, she did not always receive the king's full attention. The sister wife, granted formal authority, served a role that was more ceremonial than personal. Her presence beside the pharaoh during rituals and public appearances strengthened the image of unity and continuity, but it did not ensure affection or even true closeness. The emotional burden of being queen did not come with the advantages most might expect. She appeared in artwork and inscriptions, yet within the king's private chambers, she was often missing. The truth was that many pharaohs sought companionship, pleasure, and escape in other places. The palace was filled with women from various origins and positions, each selected for different purposes. While the queen was a result of royal planning, the concubines and attendants reflected more personal choices. Some were selected for their beauty, others for their talents in dance, music, or conversation. Many arrived from distant lands, offered as diplomatic gifts, or taken through conquest. These women, despite holding lower rank, often had closer access to the pharaoh's private life than his official wife. There were no strict limits on how many women a pharaoh could keep. The number changed from one reign to another, but in certain cases, it rose into the hundreds. These women lived inside the harem, a detailed network of courtyards, rooms and gardens that formed part of the larger palace grounds. The harem was not a prison. It functioned as a world of its own, with routines, instructors, and servants. Women within it were constantly observed. Their actions were monitored. Their behavior was guided to suit the preferences of the ruler. It was less a place of rest and more an unspoken competition for attention that never truly ended. Unlike the queen, who was restricted by formal rules, the concubines could provide something entirely different. They were expected to entertain, to comfort, and above all, to be obedient. This obedience was not always forceful, but it was organized and practiced. Their role was to give the king relief from the pressures of leadership. The moment he entered the inner quarters, the tone of politics shifted into something more personal. The women were trained to sense when to speak, when to stay quiet, and how to respond to every change in his mood. This quiet routine became woven into everyday life. When compared to today's modern view of relationships built on mutual choice, these arrangements seemed more like performance than true partnership. The pharaoh did not need to charm or convince. He simply chose, and his decision was rarely challenged. A woman could be called without notice and sent back to the harem without any explanation. There was no promise of consistency. One night could hold no meaning or change everything. Some of the most favored concubines gained influence far beyond private spaces. They received jewelry, land, and in some cases, their sons were raised as possible heirs. In a system where authority was tied to birth and favor, the mother of a preferred child could rise rapidly. Even if she had begun her life in the palace as a servant or as a gift from a distant land, her future could shift with the pharaoh's attention, and that attention was never certain. A woman might rise quickly and fall just as suddenly. Another might remain unnoticed for years before being called forward without warning. The uncertainty of the king's desires kept the harem in a constant state of silent preparation. Oils were kept ready, garments remained fresh, and bodies were cleansed daily. No one could know when her moment would come, but when it did, everything had to be flawless. While the queen stood beside the king in temples, the concubines remained in the background. Yet it was within those shadows that true closeness often existed. Unlike the formal nature of a royal marriage, the connections between pharaohs and their companions were often more direct. Some kings formed strong attachments with certain women. Others saw them as replaceable, but all recognized that the queen was distant in one way and unreachable in another. There were also deeper aspects to this system. Many of the women in the harem were not Egyptian. They came from Nubia, Syria, the Levant, and even more distant regions. They carried with them new languages, traditions, and appearances. For the pharaoh, this variety brought a sense of novelty. For the royal court, it introduced silent tensions. Foreign women held no traditional path to authority, yet their children did. And when a son of a concubine started to gain the king's favor, groups within the palace quickly took notice. It is somewhat ironic that while the queen represented Egyptian ideals, the true mothers of future rulers were sometimes outsiders, without a voice of their own. Their worth was judged by their ability to please, to conceive, and to fade away when required. No statues were built in their honor. No writings preserved their names. And yet, they influenced the bloodlines of kings. This system created a striking contrast. On one side stood the queen, quiet and elevated, her image carved into temples as a symbol of perfection. On the other side were the many unnamed women who gave the king comfort, children, and distraction. The distance between these roles was not physical. It was symbolic. The queen was sacred. The concubine was essential. Still, there were moments when these boundaries blurred. Some concubines gained such favor that they were raised to nearly equal standing. A few even challenged the queen in influence. Their living spaces became more refined. Their sons received better guidance. Their names appeared within inscriptions. But such status came with danger. Jealousy, rivalry, and betrayal. They were constant threats. The harem was not only a place of pleasure, it was also a space of silent conflict. In daily life, the queen rarely faced these women directly. She did not have to. Her position was secured by birth. But that security was not always absolute. In some situations, queens were quietly moved aside when a pharaoh's attention shifted elsewhere. In other situations, queens responded by using their connections within the priesthood or administration to weaken their rivals. The tension within the palace was not always visible, but it moved beneath every action and ritual. The pharaoh, despite all his authority, stood at the center of this silent storm. Surrounded by women who fulfilled different roles, he made his choices based on mood, ritual, or passing desire. He was not required to love his queen. He was expected to preserve appearances. What took place within the privacy of his chambers was known only to a few, and remembered by even fewer. At the edges of this carefully structured world stood the servants, the scribes and the guards, who witnessed everything but remained silent. They were the ones who lit the lamps, arranged the robes, and recorded the births. They knew which woman held favor and which one was forgotten. And in the stillness of night, as the palace grew quiet, they watched new favorites rise, while others slowly faded away. Beyond the royal wives and chosen companions, however, existed another group entirely. Women who did not come from nobility or distant kingdoms, but from servitude, and their place within the pharaoh's desires was even more unsettling. While concubines and queens competed for influence within the palace, there was yet another form of closeness reserved only for the king. It was not hidden in private. It did not occur in dim halls or perfumed chambers. Instead, it was carried out in open light before priests, dyers, and sometimes even the public. It was a ritual, and it was known as the divine union. Each year, in one of the most elaborate ceremonies of the new kingdom, the pharaoh was expected to perform a sacred act that reflected the story of Isis and Osiris. According to legend, the goddess Isis restored her fallen brother and husband Osiris and conceived the god Horus through him. This story, carved into temple walls and retold through festival songs, became the foundation for a public rite in which the living pharaoh symbolically took the place of Osiris. And to complete the story, a woman was chosen to represent Isis. The union had to be symbolically performed. The woman selected was no ordinary individual. She was a high priestess trained from an early age to serve in sacred rites. Her training included rituals, chants, and strict discipline. But her most important role came on the day of the divine union. She would rest beside the pharaoh in a prepared temple setting, her body covered with oils, her posture arranged according to strict guidance. She was not simply acting as a goddess. In the eyes of those present, she became the goddess. The surroundings were carefully organized. The temple area was purified days before. Clean linens were placed. Incense burned continuously, softening the atmosphere and masking tension. Stone basins held scented water. Statues of the gods stood around the space. The act itself, though layered with ritual meaning, was not only symbolic. It included physical connection. At times, it extended into full union. The intention was to recreate the divine creation of Horus, bringing the myth into reality once more, even if only through representation. This event was not hidden. The court was present. High-ranking officials, priests, and military leaders were expected to observe. Their presence was not for entertainment, but for confirmation. If the pharaoh was to be accepted as a living god, the moment of divine union had to be seen, acknowledged and affirmed, and acknowledged and affirmed. It was one of the rare moments in history where such performance became part of royal legitimacy. The priestess involved did not choose this role. She was prepared for it. From the moment she was selected, her life was shaped toward this purpose. She was trained not only in rituals, but in posture, breath, and composure. Her body became part of the temple's sacred practice. In many cases, she remained unmarried throughout her life. Her involvement in the divine union raised her status, but it also separated her from ordinary life. Compared to modern ceremonies where authority is passed through spoken vows, this ritual passed power through physical presence. The king's divine identity was not only declared, it was demonstrated. And that demonstration carried a physical element that few would imagine today. In the modern world, even the idea of such public closeness would cause strong reaction. In ancient Egypt, it inspired awe. The emotional impact on those involved is difficult to fully understand. The pharaoh lived under expectation, surrounded by meaning and driven by duty. To refuse the ritual was to reject divinity, but to perform, it was to step into a role few rulers in other societies ever approached. The priestess, meanwhile, held little control. She was shaped through training, formed into a vessel, then given the weight of divine expectation. The environment itself deepened the sense of strangeness. Light filtered softly through carved stone openings. Scribes stood nearby, quietly recording. Priests recited verses that blurred the boundary between reality and belief. Guards stood along the outer courts, keeping the public away, while allowing chosen witnesses inside. No voices rose above a murmur. Every movement was deliberate. Every breath, each, was measured. The ritual did not end with the act. Afterward, the priestess was cleansed and kept apart. The king emerged wearing a fresh robe, often white or gold, and was guided to the next ceremony where his divine role was announced. The union was declared complete. Offerings were presented. Celebrations followed. But at the center of it all was that private moment made public, that personal act transformed into sacred meaning. There are temple carvings that represent this ritual through symbolic imagery. Lotus blooms, intertwined, serpents, or birds in embrace suggest the union without stating it directly. But some records are more detailed. Papyrus writings describe the preparation, the participants, and the process. From these, historians have built a clearer understanding. The divine union was not just a story. It was a practiced tradition. Some pharaohs carried it out several times during their rule. Others adjusted the ritual to reflect their own views or beliefs. In rare instances, it was said that the priestess entered a trance so deep she remained still for hours afterward. Others were honored with new titles, temples, or attendants, but their roles remained the same. They had become living symbols, and once that transformation occurred, it could not be reversed. What stands out most is the calm acceptance with which these acts were received. There was no scandal, no uproar. For the Egyptian elite, the human body was simply another means in maintaining cosmic balance. There was no separation between spirit and form. Everything existed along the same line. As unusual as it may seem, the ritual served a real political purpose. It reassured the court, the priests, and the people that the king was not only a man. He had united with a goddess. He had symbolically repeated creation itself. For a brief moment, he became something beyond human. The ceremony might to have taken place once a year, but its influence carried through the entire cycle. It reinforced the rhythm of life, death, and renewal. It reminded the kingdom that divine balance remained unbroken, that their ruler had stepped into the realm of the gods and returned carrying their approval. Whether he truly believed it or not, the act had been completed, and that alone was enough. As the temple doors closed and the chanting slowly faded, the pharaoh returned to his routine life. But for the priestess, life never truly returned to what it had been. Her body had served as a stage. Her role had ended, and she would not be called again. In another part of the palace, the harem continued its silent competition, and in a separate wing the foreign concubines prepared for a different kind of meeting. One without ritual, without blessing, and without any divine presence. The divine union was not the only time a pharaoh's body became central to sacred performance. There existed another ritual, one even more personal and striking, that blurred the line between reverence and unease. Unlike the carefully arranged ceremony between the king and priestess, this ritual involved only the pharaoh himself, and instead of taking place within temple walls, it unfolded in open view beneath the sky, with priests chanting nearby and spectators gathered in quiet attention. It was known as the ritual of fertility, and at its core was an act of solitary release. Each year, when the Nile began to rise and flood the lands of Egypt, people gathered to give thanks. The river's swelling was not seen as just a natural event. It was viewed as a divine signal. In their belief system, the flooding represented the earth preparing itself, a moment when the soil opened to receive the source of life. And just as the land awaited nourishment, the ritual required the pharaoh to act. His role was to repress the masculine force of the gods, the power of creation, the origin of abundance. And that meant quite literally that he had to release that force. During this ceremony, the king stood along the banks of the Nile, dressed in light ceremonial linen, surrounded by offerings, priests, and royal attendants. The chants began gradually, calling upon the blessings of Hapi, the god of the Nile, and Osiris, the god of life and renewal. As the recitations reached their height, the pharaoh stepped toward the water's edge, lifted his hands, and carried out the act. It was not performed with shame or doubt. It was done as a symbol of fertility, a sacred reflection of divine creation. To those watching, this was not seen as something improper. It was considered essential. Without it, the land might remain barren. The harvest could fail. The gods might withdraw their support. The pharaoh's offering, given to the river or the earth, was viewed as a direct connection to life itself. It represented abundance, unity, and the continuous cycle of creation. It is both striking and unsettling that a single act could be believed to hold the fate of an entire civilization. The act was known by different names depending on the place and time. Some records describe it as the release of royal essence. Others refer to it as the act of divine continuation. Regardless of the wording, the meaning stayed the same. Each moment was believed to carry sacred power, and more than that, it was thought to awaken the hidden energy of the land, as if the pharaoh's actions stirred the earth itself into life. Compared to modern expressions of gratitude, which involve prayers, songs, or shared gatherings, this ceremony stands apart as a unique blend of devotion and physical expression. There was no barrier, no separation. The king's body, during the ritual, was no longer personal. It became a vessel for a higher power. And while the crowd watched with serious respect, it is possible that some felt private uncertainty or unease, though none would speak of it. To question the ritual was to question the river, and the river was life. Preparation for the ceremony began days earlier. The pharaoh observed fasting, purification, and smaller offerings. The location of the ritual was decorated with flowers, incense, and symbols of fertility, such as dates, figs, and carved lotus shapes. Female performers moved gently along the edges of the space. Drummers kept a steady rhythm, not loud, but flowing like a heartbeat. When the moment arrived, silence spread. The king stepped forward, and the act unfolded. No records clearly explain how the pharaoh reached completion, or how long the ritual continued. The scribes recorded its meaning, not its process. What mattered was that it took place. And once finished, the ceremony ended with celebration, the release of birds, and sometimes the lowering of vessels into the Nile to gather water believed to be touched by the king's offering. Some historians question whether the ritual was always performed physically, or if over time it became more symbolic, but early sources, especially from the Old Kingdom, suggest the act was indeed real. One inscription, carved into a temple wall, speaks of the hand of the king rising to call forth growth, a poetic yet clear image. Another shows a figure positioned near the riverbank, arm extended, with a stream flowing toward carved waves. This may feel difficult to imagine today. A ruler, exposed in public, carrying out such an act for spiritual reasons, but the Egyptian understanding of the body was different. It was not divided into sacred and ordinary. It was part of ritual, a living element within belief. The pharaoh's hand was not just a part of him. It was seen as a divine extension. His offering was not simply physical. It was regarded as sacred. What stands out most is how easily the private became public within these ancient rites. Acts that today might be seen as improper were, in that time, acts of devotion. The lines between body and belief were thinner, more open, and the king, despite his power, was not untouched by exposure. In that moment he stood alone, free of decoration, acting before both gods and people alike. For the women within the palace, watching from a distance, or hearing softly shared accounts, the ritual likely held different meanings. It was a reminder of the king's unique and singular role, a reminder that regardless of how close their nights with him may have been, the purest form of devotion was solitary, shared only with the earth itself. No queen or concubine could replace that moment of offering. Some later dynasties adjusted the ritual. They moved it indoors. They appointed substitutes. Yet the essence of the ceremony remained. The act of creation, even when reduced to a symbol, was too vital to abandon. Without it, the balance between nature and authority might falter. The waters could remain still. The gods might turn away. The gods might turn away. And so each year, as the river swelled, the people waited not only for rain or sunlight or growth, but for the king to do what only he could do, to join with the land in the most direct way, to give of himself, not through war or law or words, but through an act older than kingship itself. Afterward, as the music returned and offerings were cast into the river, the pharaoh went back to the palace. He was cleansed, dressed, and guided through halls lined with lilies and date palms. But the ceremony remained in the thoughts of those who had witnessed it. The image of a god alone in his offering was not easily forgotten. Elsewhere, behind curtains and closed doors, another kind of ritual awaited, one not performed alone, but with those who could not refuse. Women chosen not for lineage or beauty, but for their obedience, far from the public ceremonies along the Nile, where the pharaoh's body became a symbol of divine fertility. There existed another practice known to very few. It was not carved on public walls or honored with celebration. It was not carved on public walls or honored with celebration. It unfolded in darkness, in silence, and it involved a belief so deeply rooted in fear of death and the desire for renewal that even those who served the king hesitated to speak of it. This was the ritual of awakening the dead, and at its center was a union between the pharaoh and a body no longer considered living. According to fragments of private temple writings and quiet accounts preserved in hidden tombs, certain pharaohs believed that contact with a recently deceased body could stir the spirit caught between worlds. Not just any body and not just any contact. It had to be a woman. And it was believed to require more than prayers, but a physical act to complete it. The body served as a temporary vessel, a channel through which the spirit could be called back, even if only briefly. This belief, known among priests as the awakening rite, was thought to restore lost power to the living and guide wandering souls back toward the afterlife. It was not a public ceremony. The ritual took place deep within temple chambers or hidden underground spaces. Torches were put out. Only small oil lamps remained, casting a dim yellow glow across stone walls, marked with protective symbols. The air was heavy with incense, made from crushed myrrh and frankincense. No audience was allowed except for a small group of senior priests, and attendants trained to remain completely silent. The woman chosen for this role was not of royal status. She was usually a servant or concubine from the lower levels of the palace, young, compliant, and trained to follow instructions. In the day, before the ritual, she was prepared in a specific manner. Her skin was washed with sacred oils. Her mouth was cleansed with a mixture of honey and bitter herbs. Her body was wrapped in loose cloth similar to that used in burial practices. To an observer, she appeared lifeless. That was intentional. Once she had been transformed into what the priests called the silent vessel, she was taken into the ritual chamber and placed upon a slab of cold stone. Her eyes remained closed. Her breathing stayed shallow. Her arms rested across her chest. Then the pharaoh entered alone. He spoke no words. The only sound was the soft echo of priestly chants beyond the chamber. He was there to perform a rite of passage. Not emotional, not spiritual alone, but physical in nature. The figure before him symbolized the boundary between life and death. The figure before him symbolized the boundary between life and death. To cross that boundary, he had to complete the act. It is difficult to understand how such a ceremony could be accepted, even within a culture familiar with sacred symbolism and ritual practices. The act itself was viewed as part of a larger cosmic cycle, just as Osiris had been broken apart and restored by Isis and brought back for a final union. This rite reflected the idea of renewal. It was not described as intimacy. It was called restoration. Compared to modern spiritual practices centered on candles, breathing, or meditation, this ritual felt heavier, more intense, and deeply unsettling. The priests did not view it as something improper. They saw it as an act of calling forth. To them, the body was not sacred on its own, but in its ability to serve as a vessel. The dead were not truly gone. They were paused. With the right actions at the right time, they might return. No one outside the selected inner circle ever witnessed these rites. Even within temple ranks, knowledge of them was limited. Some accounts suggest that these rituals were performed only during periods of serious political unrest, when signs indicated that the balance between worlds had been disturbed. By carrying out the awakening rite, the pharaoh showed his power to restore harmony not only within the kingdom, but also between the living and the dead. The identity of the woman was never recorded. She was not honored or remembered. After the act, she was taken from the chamber and placed in isolation. In some instances, she was never seen again. It remains unclear whether she was executed, exiled, or simply erased from memory. Some scholars suggest that the ritual itself may have caused deep psychological harm, and that the silence surrounding it served to remove both her presence and her suffering. What remains in historical traces are only scattered hints. A broken line in a priest's text, a painted figure lying on stone, her eyes closed, her arms crossed, a note describing oil being poured over both bodies before the union. These fragments point to something real, something hidden beneath the stories of divine kingship and public fertility. It was not about beauty or emotion. It was about control. What feels most haunting is the stillness of it, the thought that someone could lie there fully aware, pretending to be lifeless, while the most powerful man in the land carried out a role shaped by priests long before either of them existed. It was not desire. It was duty. The king did not act for pleasure. He acted because his advisors told him the kingdom depended on it, that the gods demanded it, that without it, the spirits would wander endlessly and the land would fail to produce. The symbolism was strong, but the human cost remained unseen. The body became a tool, the soul a secondary concern. And yet, for the ancient Egyptians, this act was not seen as something improper. It was regarded as sacred. The fear of death ran so deeply in now. The need for renewal was so powerful that even the boundary between the living and the dead was made flexible in service of order. Once the ritual ended, the chamber was sealed. The king returned to his private quarters. The priests extinguished the lamps and swept the floor with bundles of reeds. No one spoke of what had occurred, yet the belief endured. A spark had been restored, a soul had been touched, and the kingdom, in some complex way, had been purified. This ritual was rare, but it was not the only one of its kind. In other parts of the palace, different forms of physical submission were being practiced. These involved women who were very much alive, women who held no divine status, no sacred story to protect them, and no choice over what was required of their bodies. In a society where the pharaoh could perform such acts in the name of cosmic balance, it might seem that few boundaries remained. Yet, not every act was accepted without limits. There were restrictions, and they were enforced with quiet but firm authority. Among them was a rule that applied especially to men, particularly those of royal lineage. It was simple in wording, yet complex in meaning. No male body under any condition was allowed to bleed during intimate activity. This belief that male blood became impure once it left the body was rooted in both religious thought and symbolic meaning. In the world of Egyptian ritual, male essence was connected to creation, fertility, and control. It was meant to remain within or be released intentionally, not to escape through harm or injury. Female bleeding, especially menstrual blood, was also approached with care, but it held a place within natural cycles of fertility. Male blood, however, had no such cycle. If it appeared, it signaled that something was wrong. This belief applied to all forms of closeness, including relationships between men and women, and between men themselves, and even ceremonial practices among the elite, particularly within the royal household. Any interaction that risked causing harm or breaking the skin was discouraged. This was not described as compassion. It was presented as doctrine. A bleeding man was seen as someone who had lost mastery over his body, and control was the very foundation of kinship. As a result, intimate practices were adjusted. Positions were changed. Roles were reassigned. In some recorded instances, ritual closeness between men, including between the pharaoh and his trusted companions, was arranged in ways that reduced physical strain. Actions that might be accepted elsewhere were avoided completely. The priests were firm. If blood touched the linens, the chamber required purification. If blood marked the floor, it was treated as a disruption of the ritual. What stands out is not only the rule itself, but the unease behind it. The fear that even a single drop of blood could disturb cosmic balance suggests a hidden fragility beneath the display of power. The male body, despite its connection to authority and dominance, was viewed as delicate in its purity. A small injury could invite spiritual disruption. It could bring disorder, compared to modern perspectives that emphasize consent, communication, and emotional well-being. This ancient system was guided by an unseen structure of bodily control. The aim was not pleasure or understanding, but preservation. Every act was measured against the risk of impurity, and impurity was a danger the royal family could not risk. This concern shaped palace life in subtle yet constant ways. Guards, attendants, and scribes were trained to observe the physical condition of those near the pharaoh. If a male companion showed signs of harm, he was removed from close contact. If a favored servant suffered a cut or injury, even if unrelated to intimacy, he could be reassigned to temple duties or lower roles. There was no space for uncertainty. Blood did not only mark cloth, it marked status within the context of male relationships. This fear created a unique contradiction. While it was not unusual for pharaohs to engage in such connections, the acts themselves had to remain strictly controlled. Penetration, if it occurred, was limited and carefully managed. In some cases, alternatives were used. Objects made from polished ivory or smooth stone carved into symbolic forms were used instead of direct contact. These items were seen as safer, more controlled, and easier to manage. It was also common to assign ritual roles that placed one man in a receptive position, often described in temple records as the receiver of breath. This title reflected spiritual yielding rather than physical dominance. The act was arranged to highlight symbolic exchange rather than bodily satisfaction. The aim was unity, not completion. What stands out most is how the fear of impurity shaped not only rules, but behavior and identity. To take a passive role was not considered dishonorable, but to bleed was. To show signs of injury suggested weakness, and in a system where weakness had no place, men learned to hide, adjust, and sometimes withdraw entirely. This extended even to personal care. Royal men, especially those involved in ritual or private roles, were kept under constant physical observation. Their skin was shaved, their nails were trimmed. Any cuts or irritation were carefully noted by palace healers. Treatments made from beeswax and lotus resin were applied to prevent friction or infection. There was an entire silent system designed to preserve the condition of the male body. Priests sometimes acted as enforcers of this standard. For certain ceremonies, they inspected participants not only for cleanliness, but also for signs of bleeding. Even a small crack on the lip could lead to removal. The focus on unbroken skin became part of a wider concern with maintaining perfect order. Just as a damaged statue had to be repaired, so too did the body need to remain intact. These limitations may seem extreme, even restrictive, but they aligned with a worldview that feared disorder above all else. Egypt was a land shaped by the rhythm of the Nile, by the predictability of cycles. Anything that disrupted that rhythm was viewed with suspicion, and nothing disturbed it more than uncontrolled bodily fluids. This belief also influenced how punishments were carried out. When a male servant or companion was disciplined, it was done with softer tools, wooden rods wrapped in linen, flat paddles carved from palm wood, or bundles of reeds soaked in water. The aim was to bruise, not break the skin. Pain was permitted, blood was not. A bleeding servant was a concern. A bleeding noble could become a disgrace. Even the burial practices, Even the burial practices reflect this belief. Male mummies were prepared with extra attention. Special resins were applied to seal the skin. Internal organs were removed with careful precision to limit any opening. The idea was that a male body should return to the earth as whole as it had lived. To enter the afterlife with a wound or cut was to arrive in an impure state, and so the practices continued. Intimacy remained, but always under careful observation. A kingdom ruled by divine order could not allow weakness, even in the body. The pharaoh's strength rested not only in his crown, but in the image that his body was flawless, protected, beyond harm. But not everyone within the palace received such care. In the outer sections, far from the scented chambers and polished bathing halls, there were other bodies, unfamiliar bodies, unprotected ones. They bled when handled, and no one paused to tend to them. While the royal men were guarded by layers of ritual and discipline to shield their bodies from even the smallest injury, others within the palace system were not given the same concern. For them, the body had no clear limits. There was no safeguard, no inspection, and no priest present to prevent misuse. Among the quietest figures in this complex structure were the servants assigned to temple duties, especially the women chosen for a purpose rarely mentioned in official records. They were not there to clean, recite, or prepare incense. They were presented before the statues of gods as living forms within certain sacred spaces, particularly those linked to fertility deities such as Min or Hathor. These rituals involved the presence of female servants, whose role was to sustain or awaken the symbolic energy of the god's image. The statue itself, often carved from stone or wood and covered with gold, stood at the center of the sanctuary. It represented the god not only as a symbol, but as a living force. And for that force to remain active, it had to be stimulated. To fulfill this, women were selected and instructed in how to stand, how to breathe, and how to remain motionless for extended periods. Their clothing, if it could be described as such, was made from thin linen treated with oil to rest closely against the skin. Their hair was scented and styled into careful coils. Their bodies were arranged into precise positions, often with hips angled forward, arms lifted, or legs slightly parted. These positions were not random. They followed a pattern understood only by temple officials. Each stance reflected a different divine state. These women were not permitted to speak during the ritual. They were instructed to keep their gaze fixed on the statue, never to look away. They could not move or react, even when the air turned cold or insects touched their skin. They were expected to become living extensions of divine intent. The priests referred to them as receivers of presence. The term implied stillness, but the reality was far more demanding, more intrusive, and more enduring than it suggested. What stands out most is the level of stillness these women were required to maintain, not as reflection but as a display of total surrender. They were meant to represent not devotion, but invitation. Their entire posture had to convey availability, that they had no personal will, that their presence itself was an offering. Compared to modern religious practices where meaning is often expressed through candles or spoken words, these rituals used the human body as a direct medium of worship. There were no symbols standing in place of action. The expression was physical. The gods were not believed to require only offerings of food or incense. They required engagement, and this engagement came through the bodies of those without a voice. In certain festivals, these acts went beyond symbolic meaning. In rare and troubling instances mentioned in lesser-known temple records, priests interacted directly with the women under the belief of channeling divine force. The reasoning followed a fixed pattern. The god's presence entered the statue. The statue's energy passed to the priest. The priest's touch then carried it to the woman. Within this system, personal choice vanished. Not every temple followed such practices. Not every period accepted them. But where they occurred, they were documented with formality, without any sense of wrongdoing. One scroll from a temple in Thebes describes the moment when the god is believed to stir, followed by a sequence of positions assigned to the attendants. Another, now incomplete, lists names of women alongside dates and places as though they were part of a record. There are no prayers for their protection, no tools marking their return. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is the silence surrounding it all. These women were not seen as participants. They were treated as instruments. The priest who positioned them before the statue did not address them. The guards who stood nearby did not intervene. The rest of the temple staff turned away. This silence became part of the ritual. Sound was believed to disturb the presence of the god. Only the rhythm of drums or the soft notes of flutes filled the chamber. Everything else remained still. After the ceremony, the women were taken back into seclusion. Some were washed with salt water to remove what was believed to be divine residue. Others were left unwashed, as if to preserve the contact. No medical attention was given unless they collapsed. In some temples, those who fainted during the ritual were judged as too weak and removed permanently. Their role ended the moment their bodies could no longer endure. It is difficult not to see this practice as a point where spirituality turned into exploitation, where devotion became indistinguishable from harm. The belief in divine need, so central to Egyptian thought, allowed such actions to continue. The god desired. The statue received. The woman obeyed. These temple attendants were not always native Egyptians. Many were taken from conquered lands. Their foreign origin added to their perceived value. Priests believed that women from distant regions carried different energies, perhaps stronger or more receptive. Their appearance was unfamiliar. Their language was foreign. Their presence seemed rare and therefore suitable for divine service. No part of their past mattered once they were chosen. They were given new names. Their histories erased. Their roles were defined entirely by ritual. Even their cycles were observed, not for care, but for timing. A woman who bled was considered unclean. A woman in a fertile phase was preferred. They were moved between temples, sometimes transferred from one city to another, depending on the needs of the ritual and the authority of the priests. And yet, their identities remain lost in history. No statue was built in their honor. No tomb preserved their memory. They were not wives, not queens, not even concubines. They were the hands, the hips, the forms that the gods were believed to behold. And when the ritual ended, they disappeared behind veils, replaced by others. The pharaoh himself rarely attended these ceremonies. His role within temple life was more symbolic, more distant, yet he upheld the system that made them possible. His priests acted in his name. His silence allowed it. This meeting, point of devotion and control, created a space where belief could justify almost anything. The women were not seen as harmed. They were viewed as elevated, as if contact with the divine, even indirectly, was an honor. But the body keeps memory, the strain in muscles from long stillness, the breath held within heavy incense, the eyes fixed upon unmoving statues. These women carried the burden of the divine, not through titles or crowns, but through silence. Outside the temple walls, other practices continued, with less ceremony yet no less control. There, the aim was not to awaken sacred force, but to create lineage. And in those spaces, even family boundaries could blur. Within the inner sanctuaries where attendants stood as offerings before statues, belief often overcame hesitation. And in certain rare, closely guarded rituals, belief went even further. There were ceremonies so hidden and controversial that even among priests, knowledge of them was limited. These were not rituals of public display or royal presence. They belonged to an older layer of belief, one that focused on fertility in its most raw and fundamental form. And at the center of some of these practices was an idea difficult to comprehend today. A symbolic union involving animals. To understand how such a concept could emerge, one must consider the meaning animals held in Egyptian belief. The gods themselves were often shown with animal features. Bulls symbolized strength and vitality. Donkeys were linked to endurance. Cats, crocodiles, and falcons each represented different divine qualities. Statues were not only shaped to resemble these beings. The animals themselves, in many cases, were believed to carry aspects of the gods. A bull chosen by the temple could be seen as more than an animal. It could be viewed as a living vessel of divine presence. The ceremonies involving animals were not common. They did not take place in every region or temple. But some surviving writings and fragmented traditions suggest that in isolated areas, particularly during seasonal fertility festivals, rituals occurred where human participants were guided to engage with animals in acts intended to reflect the connection between nature and divinity. These were not treated as crimes in that ancient context. They were seen as sacred representations of the forces believed to sustain life. The participants were not ordinary people. They were temple specialists, often women raised within the religious system from a young age. Some were referred to as divine attendants. Others belonged to lower levels of the priesthood. Their roles in public ceremonies included singing, movement, or purification duties. But within these hidden rituals, their responsibilities changed. Their bodies became instruments of invocation. What makes this practice even more unsettling is that it was not chaotic or unplanned. It was carefully structured, timed, and carried out under strict supervision. The temple prepared the setting. The animal was selected and purified. The animal was selected and purified. The participant fasted, bathed in milk and honey, and was treated with lotus oil. Garments were removed. The animal was secured in place, and then the ritual was performed. Compared to symbolic fertility practices in other ancient cultures where such acts were only suggested or represented, this extended into a realm that modern values struggle to understand. The union was not symbolic. It was believed to create a form of energy meant to awaken the land and reflect the mythical moment when divine forces first shaped life. No audience was present, but a small group of senior priests and temple scribes stood nearby. Their presence was not for observation in a casual sense. It was formal. They were witnesses responsible for confirming that the ritual had been completed properly. These rites often coincided with agricultural cycles. The beginning of planting, the arrival of floods, or certain solar events could determine the timing. The logic followed a closed circle. The god existed within the animal. The priestess joined with the animal. Through her, the god was stirred. The land responded. Crops flourished. Balance returned. The animal was never harmed afterward. That would have broken the sacred nature of the act. It was usually led back into seclusion, fed with special offerings and carefully observed. It became sacred in a different sense, having now been touched by both divine belief and human ritual. In some temples, such animals were buried with honor after death, wrapped in linen and placed in tombs alongside sacred objects. For the women involved, there is no record of choice or resistance. Their names are not preserved. Their experiences are not described. What remains are only structured accounts of what they were expected to perform. A stone relief from a temple in a distant region shows a woman kneeling before a horned creature. Her expression is calm. Her form is shaped into stylized lines similar to depictions of the gods. Another image shows a donkey surrounded by symbols of fertility, rhythm, and breath. These images are rare, set into lower walls, almost as if meant to remain unnoticed. The priests who created these rituals described them as acts of restoration, not harm. They believed the world had become barren and that only the oldest practices could renew it. These were actions driven by urgency, framed through belief. The earth needed to be awakened. The gods needed to be stirred. And for that, the limits of the human experience were pushed aside. What feels most unsettling is the deliberate way these rituals were preserved, not as stories, but as instructions. There was nothing symbolic about them in their original setting. They were treated with the same importance as burial rites or coronations. The difference was that they were hidden from view, known only to a small group who passed them down from one generation to another. Over time, these practices disappeared as Egypt changed, as new dynasties rose, and as outside influences arrived. These acts were first forgotten in memory, and later lost entirely. The texts describing them vanished or were destroyed. The temples that held them fell into ruin. The participants passed away without names. Yet faint traces still remain. Fragments of text, incomplete carvings, vague references in later writings hint at a union between beast and vessel. These remnants suggest a world where the sacred and the forbidden were not opposites, but closely intertwined, where belief could stretch far enough to justify what might otherwise seem unimaginable. The women who took part were not described as harmed. They were labeled as chosen, and that single word replaced everything else. The pharaoh himself rarely participated directly in such ceremonies, but he allowed them. He supported them. He approved the training of those involved. In doing so, he permitted the boundary between human and animal, devotion and submission, to be crossed in the name of sustaining life. And while such practices eventually faded from the temples, their influence did not disappear. In other areas of palace life, new methods for ensuring fertility emerged. Methods that did not involve animals, but focused instead on the body itself, particularly within the most protected circles of the royal household. As rituals involving animals gradually disappeared into secrecy and were eventually forgotten, another set of practices remained woven into everyday palace life. These did not occur in distant sanctuaries or under the direct supervision of high-ranking priests. They took place in private chambers, in bathing rooms, in small containers, hidden behind curtains, and their focus was on a substance that has carried mixed meaning across many cultures: menstrual blood. To the ancient Egyptians, blood was not simply a fluid. It represented life, intention, and force in physical form. When it flowed from injury, it signaled weakness. When it was shed in battle, it represented sacrifice. But menstrual blood occupied a different space altogether. It was a sign of potential life, yet also a marker that set women apart. In religious contexts, it was often considered impure. But within certain circles of the palace, among selected queens and priestesses, it was understood differently, as something that could be used. Some writings suggest a belief that the blood of a young or royal woman carried unusual properties. It was thought to contain a kind of raw, unrefined energy, capable of influencing emotion and desire. If carefully collected and combined with drink, it was believed to create a mixture considered powerful and persuasive. This mixture was not presented in public rituals. It was not presented in public rituals. It was, as given in private, often concealed, sometimes offered just before moments of closeness. The king or prince might drink from the cup, either unaware of what it contained or fully aware and accepting. The reasoning behind it was not only secrecy, it was rooted in belief. The blood was thought to represent unused fertility, something that had not yet become life, but carried the potential to create it. When combined with drink, that essence was believed to be activated, made fluid, and able to enter the body of a man. It was not meant to create life directly, but to form a symbolic and emotional connection between him and the woman who provided it. What makes this idea especially notable is the shift it created in a society where men held most visible power. This practice offered women a hidden form of influence. They could affect rulers, not through persuasion or charm, but through something more subtle. Their bodies became sources of control, not only reproduction. The queen who provided the blood was seen as more than a partner. She became a figure of influence that extended beyond private spaces. Compared to modern ideas of attraction or presentation, this was less about appearance and more about belief in the body itself. There were no adornments or performances, only the idea that what came from the body could return through another and influence thought or feeling. Some accounts suggest that certain queens extended this belief further. Instead of mixing the substance into drinks, they used it in bathing rituals. According to scattered records and later interpretations, this involved collecting the monthly blood of selected women and adding it to warm water combined with oils. The queen would then immerse herself for a period of time. This was not viewed as cleansing, but as a form of absorption. The intention was to take in that perceived energy, to reclaim or strengthen what was believed to reside within it. It was believed to preserve beauty, strengthen confidence, and protect against rivals. There is no clear evidence that such baths were common. They would have required time, secrecy, and careful preparation. The collection itself depended on quiet cooperation. Young women were selected, often without full understanding of the purpose. Servants gathered the material using strips of linen, then pressed them into clay basins. The cloth was later burned to prevent reuse. The bath was arranged in silence. The room remained dim. No mirrors were present. Only oil lamps flickered along the walls. The queen entered alone, sometimes with a single attendant who remained visually restricted. She removed her robe slowly and stepped into the tinted water, breathing in the sharp scent mixed with oils and resins. She did not speak. She closed her eyes, and for a brief moment she believed herself untouchable. No songs described this ritual. No wall paintings recorded it. Yet its influence lingered in court stories and quiet recollections passed between servants. They spoke of queens who held power longer than others, whose presence made even the pharaoh pause, whose words carried weight even in silence. What stands out most is how these private actions were believed to shape public outcomes. A ruler might change a decision, an official might lose favor, another might suddenly rise, and no clear reason would be given. But the queen's presence seemed to carry its own meaning. Some historians question these accounts. They suggest such practices may be exaggerated or symbolic, rather than literal. Yet, ancient Egyptian culture often blended belief with daily life, merging the divine with the human, the symbolic with the physical. In such a world, it is not difficult to imagine that individuals, especially those within restricted systems, found subtle ways to influence their surroundings. Even the idea of purity was not fixed. What one authority considered impure, another might see as sacred. Menstrual blood existed within that tension. It could limit a woman's role in one context, yet be viewed as a source of hidden strength in another. That duality was not accidental. It created space for women to act from the edges of power, always present, always carrying a certain risk. There is no clear record of how men responded to these practices. No texts openly express rejection or acceptance. Yet the absence of such voices is telling. In a kingdom guided by rituals and omens, a ruler who drank from such a cup could not easily acknowledge it. To speak of it might weaken its meaning. To ignore it meant remaining within its influence. These practices rarely extended beyond the palace. They were not meant for common life, not for markets or villages. They belonged to the inner halls, the polished floors, the scented corridors, where power moved quietly through suggestion, presence, and substances, rarely spoken of aloud. Just beyond these private spaces, however, another kind of transformation was believed to take place. A different ritual, more structured and more visible, began to shape how death and physical presence were connected, not through mixtures or hidden acts, but through stillness and silence. While some royal women sought influence during the pharaoh's life, others were called upon at the moment of his passing. In ancient Egyptian belief, death was not seen as an abrupt end, but as a transition. The body was not simply prepared for burial. It was guided, and among the many rites surrounding royal death, there was one described in some accounts as the warming of the soul. This ritual was said to begin when the pharaoh's final breath was confirmed. His body was not immediately taken for preservation. Instead, it was placed upon a ceremonial platform, treated with oils, and surrounded by flowers and burning resins. The chamber was cleared of men. Only selected women were permitted to enter, and they were instructed to remove their outer garments. Not just a few, but many. The reasoning behind this act was not viewed as symbolic alone. It was believed that the natural warmth of the human body, especially one associated with life and creation, could help guide the departing soul, assisting it in finding its path beyond the physical world. The newly departed spirit, uncertain and lingering, was believed to be gently guided toward its journey if it sensed familiar elements of life, emotion, memory, and human presence. In this view, the body was not simply lifeless. It was a vessel suspended between two states, and the women present were seen as a bridge between them. The participants included royal attendants, palace servants, and sometimes even daughters of noble families, sent for this role. Each had been prepared in advance. They were trained to express grief in a structured way, through controlled movements, soft sounds, and rhythmic gestures. Alongside mourning, however, came another instruction: to remain close, to maintain presence, to create a sense of warmth and continuity. A few were chosen to lie beside the body, maintaining physical proximity. One or two were guided to position themselves in ways meant to symbolically reconnect the still form with the living world, their eyes closed, their movements measured and quiet. What stands out most is how grief and ritual merged in this setting, where emotion and duty became almost inseparable. These women were not there to show personal affection. They were there to assist in transition, The belief held that a departing soul might hesitate if the body remained cold and abandoned. But if it was surrounded by warmth, by familiar human presence, and by the subtle reminders of life, the spirit might release its hold and move onward. Compared to modern funerary practices, which often separate physical presence from symbolic ceremony, this ritual brought both together into one intense moment. There were no distant prayers or silent observation. Everything was immediate. The sorrow was expressed. The presence was structured. The warmth of the living was offered to the still form. Descriptions of this ritual are linked to fragments of a text sometimes referred to as the Book of Divine Rebirth, preserved in partial inscriptions on tomb walls and temple surfaces. These writings described the gathering of breath, a process in which female mourners encircled the body and called to the departing spirit through warmth and closeness. One damaged line instructs the women to move without sound, to remind the body of its passage. Another suggests continuing until the body fully cools, marking the completion of transition. There is no reference to male involvement in these accounts. The role of men in this ritual was limited to preparation and protection. They escorted the women inside. They stood guard beyond the entrance. They lit the lamps, but they did not witness what followed. This was considered a rite belonging to women, both intimate and ceremonial, kept from male view and recorded only through symbols. The chamber where it occurred was never used again. After the ritual, the body was moved for preservation. The room was sealed, sometimes even dismantled. The women were led away and cleansed in silence. Some returned to the inner quarters, others disappeared from record. In rare cases, inscriptions mention a woman with the title, "She who warmed the throne," a P.Esh, raise that carried quiet significance, yet offered no detail. The ritual was not regarded as improper. It was viewed as necessary. Just as the pharaoh entered life through a woman, he would leave it surrounded by them. The act was not meant to restore life, but to guide its departure, a final passage from the physical world into the divine. There are no clear visual depictions of this ceremony, no temple scenes illustrated. Yet scattered references appear in coded phrases such as the chamber of return, the circle of breath, or the night of unveiled sorrow. Each suggests a practice that remained hidden, yet remembered. What stands out is not only the ritual itself, but how seamlessly it was integrated into the process of royal transition. The women were not described in terms of force, but expectation. They were trained, prepared, and yet placed in a role that required contact with a body that could not respond. Their actions were not for personal feeling, but for duty. It is difficult to know their inner experience. No personal accounts survive, only instructions recorded by others. The reasoning behind the rite reflects a broader focus on continuity. Death was seen as disruption. Physical closeness symbolized what had been lost. By recreating a sense of connection, even briefly, the idea of wholeness was restored. The soul, surrounded by familiar presence, was believed to move on more easily. The order of the state continued. The world remained stable after the body was gone. And afterward, silence. The women did not speak of it, not even among themselves. The ritual marked a threshold. Once crossed, it was left behind, yet its meaning carried forward, into the burial, into the tomb, into the quiet stories preserved by priests and written in fading ink. Outside the tomb, life continued. Preparations began for the next reign. A new pharaoh would rise, and the cycle of court traditions would begin again. The transfer of power after a pharaoh's death was not only a change in title, but a reshaping of the entire palace system. A new ruler meant new roles, new alliances, and new women entering the royal household. These arrivals were not grand or ceremonial. They entered quietly, through lesser gates, guided by attendants, dressed in simple linen. They came not as queens or companions, but as servants presented by noble families, or brought from distant regions. Before they could take on any role, they underwent a formal initiation that marked their entry into palace life. This process, sometimes described as a unveiling, was meant to establish identity, status, and readiness. Upon entering the inner courtyard, their names were recorded, their clothing set aside, and they stood in stillness, eyes lowered. The process was overseen not by male officials, but by senior women, often led by the queen, and supported by experienced attendants whose roles combined elements of care, order, and tradition. Their demeanor was controlled, focused, and authoritative. The purpose of this ritual centered on classification and preparation. Each individual was assessed carefully, not only for physical condition, but also for composure, health, and responsiveness. Observations were made quietly, sometimes inferred through posture, breathing, and reaction, other times through closer inspection. Cloths treated with oils or resins might be used as part of this process, and attendants noted subtle details without open commentary. These observations were then recorded, forming the basis for how each woman would be placed within the structured environment of the palace. However, this assessment extended beyond a single concern. It was part of a broader system that determined roles, responsibilities, and proximity to power within a highly controlled and hierarchical world. The body itself was carefully observed for signs of what was believed to be alignment with palace expectations. Certain physical traits were interpreted symbolically. Broad hips were associated with fertility. Upright posture suggested discipline. Balanced facial features were thought to reflect harmony, a valued quality in ritual settings. Even skin tone could be linked to symbolic associations with particular shrines or traditions. What stands out in this process is how the female body became a surface for judgment, a place where decisions about status and role were imposed. These young women were not assessed as individuals, but as potential function bearers within a rigid system. Compared to modern hiring or evaluation methods, this process was immediate, physical, and final. A single perceived imperfection could shape a person's entire future. There was no appeal, no discussion, and little room for personal agency. Those who met the expectations were moved to another area, where they were given standard garments, instructed in behavior, and assigned initial duties. Some assisted with incense, others maintained ceremonial items, while a few were trained in performance roles such as music or movement. With time, some could advance, gaining closer proximity to influential spaces within the palace. Those who did not meet the criteria were not dismissed outright. Instead, they were reassigned. Many were sent to temple-related roles in different locations. Their responsibilities shifted from serving within the palace to participating in temple routines. This did not simply involve maintaining shrines or preparing offerings. It often included highly structured roles where presence, posture, and endurance were emphasized. Long periods of stillness, specific attire, and strict behavioral expectations became part of their daily life. Guided and monitored by senior temple officials, the girl was no longer viewed as a servant. She became a conduit within the system. Her body, once judged unsuitable for palace roles, was reassigned meaning within temple structures. Once transferred, her identity was often altered in records. Contact with her past life faded, and her role was redefined entirely by ritual expectations. In rare cases, if a girl displayed particular qualities, her form might be recorded in temple archives, not as a personal likeness, but as a reference for posture, alignment, and expression. The unveiling was therefore more than an introduction. It was a decisive turning point. In a single moment, futures were redirected. Small details, a tremor, stillness, or hesitation could be interpreted in ways that shaped outcomes. These judgments were not scientific. They were based on belief and interpretation. The body was read as if it carried meaning in every detail, and each observation contributed to the role assigned. Some accounts suggest that the queen's role in this process was largely symbolic. She represented the structure rather than intervening in it. The hierarchy among women within the palace could be as strict as any other system. After the evaluation, the girls were not reassured. They were prepared. They were bathed again, often in silence, and their previous belongings were removed. What remained was a controlled identity, ready to fit into a predefined role. What stands out most is the absence of personal voice. No records describe how these individuals felt. No accounts capture their thoughts. The process was treated as routine, necessary, even sacred. Yet the emotional weight carried by those undergoing it remains unknown. This system reflects a broader reality of the court. Power was not only defined by status or lineage, but by proximity. Access determined influence, and entry into that space came with conditions. To be inside the palace was considered a privilege, but it required surrender in personal autonomy. Once within the system, individuals were shaped, assigned, and used according to roles they did not choose. Some adapted over time. Others faded quietly into the structure itself. The unveiling ritual was not an isolated act. It was part of a larger framework that governed life within the palace. Before entering the priesthood, this process formed part of a wider system of physical evaluation and reassignment that shaped roles within elite and temple life. In another chamber, a different kind of initiation was believed to take place, one not centered on inspection, but on submission and ritual obedience. The unveiling of palace attendants was only one aspect of how bodies and identities were structured in that world. Beyond the palace within temple complexes, another form of initiation existed. It did not involve royal lineage or political power, but it was considered equally important within the religious hierarchy. In ancient Egyptian belief, serving in a temple was among the highest duties. Entry into such roles was not based solely on knowledge or devotion. It required demonstration through ritual. According to some interpretations of temple traditions, candidates underwent intense preparation before being accepted. This included fasting, repeated purification, silence, and physical readiness. The initiate would be brought into a secluded space. After these preparations, his appearance reflected transformation: shaved head, oiled skin, simple linen, and symbolic objects, such as a lotus flower. A senior figure within the temple, often someone with long experience and authority, guided the final stage of the process. This figure represented continuity, discipline, and the weight of tradition, rather than personal identity. The setting itself was carefully arranged, with lamps, incense, and symbolic carvings associated with deities such as Hathor, reinforcing the sacred atmosphere. It's important to note that many descriptions of such rites come from fragmented sources, interpretations, or later retellings, and historians debate how literal or symbolic these accounts are. Ancient Egyptian rituals often blended physical, symbolic, and spiritual elements in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct today. What remains clear is that initiation into religious roles was treated as a profound transformation. It marked a shift from ordinary identity into one defined by duty, discipline, and alignment with temple order. There was no music, no prayer, no audience at first. Only one person entered after the act had begun, a temple scribe, carrying a reed brush and a roll of papyrus. What makes this ritual especially difficult to comprehend is how it framed intimacy as a form of erasure. The man was not allowed to speak, not allowed to express desire, not allowed to question. His arousal was not personal. It was required. The priestess was not present as a partner, but as a vessel of transformation. Together, they performed what the priests called the exchange of boundaries. Compared to modern religious initiations, which rely on vows or symbolic gestures, this ritual demanded complete surrender of bodily autonomy in the name of spiritual alignment. The physical act marked the moment the man shed his identity as a layperson. After climax, he was expected to weep, not from emotion, but from the release of ego. If he remained composed, the ritual was considered incomplete. The scribe, seated a short distance away, did not record words. Instead, he drew the outlines of the act, the curvature of bodies, the placement of limbs, and the sequence of movement. These sketches were not preserved as a rot. They were stored as proof. If the man's spiritual integrity was ever questioned in the future, the scroll could be produced to confirm that he had undergone the ritual correctly. In some temples, these scrolls were kept for generations. In others, they were burned immediately after the candidate was accepted, offered to the gods as a final act of devotion. The moment itself, however, was never spoken of again. It became a memory shared only between the priest, the priestess, and the silent scribe whose brush had documented the transformation. The ritual was not optional. Refusal meant permanent exclusion from temple service. A candidate who resisted might be reassigned to agricultural labor or minor guard duties. His name would be removed from training records. In extreme cases, He would be sent to work among the laborers who maintained the temple grounds. There was no punishment, no explanation, only silence. Some candidates did not resist, but failed to perform. In such cases, temple healers were summoned to administer herbal stimulants. If arousal still did not occur, the candidate was marked as spiritually blocked and quietly dismissed. The act of physical readiness was interpreted as divine approval. A failing body was seen as a sign that the soul was not yet prepared to serve. The priestess who performed the act did not change roles afterward. She remained in her position, continuing her daily duties, leading chants, interpreting omens, and overseeing sacrifices. The act did not elevate her. It was simply part of her service. And if she found it unpleasant or painful, she was not permitted to speak of it. The ritual demanded detachment from both participants. What I find most revealing is the level of bureaucracy layered over such an intimate act. The presence of documentation, scheduling, and post-ritual reporting turned something deeply human into a fore. Men of administration. The body became a checklist, the soul became a requirement, and the act itself became a transaction, remembered only as recorded data. The ritual's origins remain unclear. Some believe it began during the Middle Kingdom, when temple hierarchies became more formalized. Others trace it back to older fertility rites that were later absorbed into priestly culture. Regardless of its beginnings, by the time of the New Kingdom, it had become institutionalized. Every major temple had a chamber set aside for this purpose. Every class of priest included men who had passed through it. There are no records of any woman refusing to perform the rite. Whether through duty, pressure, or belief, they all participated. The younger priests did not speak of it among themselves. They were told that speaking diminished its sanctity, that remembering it too clearly meant it had not truly worked. And yet, despite the silence, the ritual left its marks, not on the body, but in behavior. Men who had undergone the rite often moved more slowly. They kept their eyes lowered, their hands remained close to their bodies. Some looked at the priestess afterward with fear, others with reverence, but always with distance. The ritual served its purpose. It broke the man, not as punishment, but as preparation. The ego was removed. What remained was a vessel, ready to carry incense, to interpret dreams, to enter temple space, without the weight of personal ambition. And once that threshold had been crossed, another awaited. A ritual with no priestess, no sketch, and no privacy at all. Only the young man, a mirror, and a sharp object he would have to wield against himself in silence. The priesthood required men to surrender their personal selves before stepping onto sacred ground. But for those born into the royal family, the expectations went even deeper. While temple initiates were stripped of identity through ritual, princes were shaped from birth for a single purpose. That purpose was not governance or warfare. It was reproduction, not with whomever they desired, but with women who shared their blood. Among the highest mandates within the royal household was the continuation of divine lineage. The pharaoh was not simply a ruler. He was the living embodiment of the gods. And because the gods themselves were believed to marry their siblings, royal heirs were expected to look inward when seeking a mate, a sister, a half-sister, an aunt, a cousin born from the same sacred line. These were not accidental unions. They were deliberate, carefully orchestrated, and reinforced through law, myth, and even architecture. Marriage between siblings within the royal family carried no shame. It carried prestige. The closer the blood, the purer the line. To produce a child with a sister was considered the highest act of devotion to divine order. These children were not seen as biological risks. They were viewed as manifestations of perfection. Carved reliefs depicted them seated beside their parents, tiny crowns resting on their heads. Inscriptions praised their eyes, their posture, even their breath. They were not simply infants. They were symbols. The pressure to produce such a child often fell most heavily on the firstborn male heir. From an early age, he was paired with one or more of his sisters. Their education included shared lessons, shared meals, and eventually shared quarters. The pairing was arranged long before either had reached maturity. Servants were instructed to monitor their interactions, while priests offered blessings at the first signs of affection. Their first union was not spontaneous. It was scheduled, woven into a larger ritual complete with offerings and chants. What makes this practice especially difficult to understand is the sense of formality it carried within the royal court. The concept of incest, as understood today, simply did not exist in that world. There were no taboos, no warnings, no hesitation. The sisters were prepared for their roles, just as the brothers were. It was not a matter of choice. It was destiny. Compared to modern monarchies, where alliances are built across families and regions, the Egyptian court turned inward, placing no trust in outsiders. Marriage to a foreign queen carried risk. Marriage to a commoner diluted the divine. The solution, repeated across generations, was to keep the circle closed. Of course, not every child born of these unions was healthy. Over time, the genetic consequences of repeated inbreeding began to appear. Some royal offspring were born with visible deformities. Others died before reaching their first year. There were cases of clubbed feet, fused toes, elongated skulls, and cognitive impairments. Yet even these children were honored in death. Their small tomes were inscribed with the same reverence given to adult kings. In one notable case, a child who lived only a few weeks was mummified, wrapped in linen, and buried with a golden amulet placed over his heart. These deaths were not seen as failures. They were seen as mysteries. The gods, it was believed, gave and took as they pleased. If a child died, it was because his soul was needed elsewhere. If he survived with deformities, it was because his body had been shaped for a purpose beyond understanding. The priests never blamed the unions. Instead, they pointed to omens, to the alignment of stars, or to forgotten offenses from a past life. Within this framework, women carried a different kind of burden. A sister who failed to conceive was seen as lacking divine favor. A sister who gave birth to a stillborn child was believed to be under a test from the gods. Some were quietly removed from the gods. Some were quietly removed from the palace, while others remained silent, observed, until a younger sibling was elevated in their place. The hierarchy among sisters was never fixed. It shifted constantly, with each passing month, with each failed attempt, with each pregnancy. The pharaoh himself was rarely given a choice. His father's advisors arranged the match. His mother often approved it. The queen mother held immense influence in these decisions, having once been the chosen sister herself. She understood what was expected and ensured that the pattern continued. To deviate from it would invite doubt, and within the palace, doubt was poison. There are records of pharaohs who took multiple sisters as wives, not out of affection, but to increase the likelihood of producing a healthy heir. These marriages were not romantic, they were calculated. If one sister failed, another might succeed. The women lived in adjacent quarters. Their cycles were tracked. Their diets were monitored. Even their dreams were recorded. The first sign of pregnancy was treated like a victory in battle. The children born of these unions grew up with a strange dual status. They were adored, pampered, and praised, yet at the same time deeply isolated. They had no playmates from outside the royal bloodline, no connection to the world beyond the palace walls. Their lives were confined to marble halls, fine linen, and silence. Every gesture they made was interpreted. Every word they spoke was recorded. They did not belong to their parents. They belonged to the gods. What unsettles me most is how devotion to the bloodline overrode even the natural instinct to protect one's child. The system continued even as it began to fail, even as signs of decline became increasingly clear. The structure of power was so rigid that it could not bend, only break, and when it did, the damage was often invisible. A king might rise with a hidden illness. A queen might miscarry in silence. A child might be buried without a name, yet the practice continued, not because it worked, but because it was believed to be sacred. In ancient Egypt, belief held more power than evidence. In rare cases, a pharaoh attempted to marry outside the family. These attempts were met with resistance. The priesthood warned of divine wrath. Advisors whispered of political instability. Even if such a marriage was allowed, the child born from it would never be considered equal. The blood was seen as too diluted, the connection to the gods too distant. And so, the circle closed once again. Brothers and sisters, uncles and nieces, cousins whose names echoed one another, gathered in torchlit halls, reciting prayers written long before their births. They touched one another not with passion, but with expectation. Yet even within this closed world, there were moments when love emerged where it was not meant to. When a prince turned his gaze not toward his sister, but toward a servant girl. And when that happened, the consequences were swift, severe, and hidden behind doors no one dared to open. The sons born of these sacred unions were raised with extreme care, constantly observed for signs of divine inheritance. But even birth into the royal bloodline was not enough. Before a pharaoh could ascend the throne, he had to pass through a series of spiritual trials. Some were public, coronation rites, offerings before the people. Others unfolded in private chambers, where symbols carried more weight than words. Among the most mysterious of these was the ritual of gender inversion. To connect with the goddess Isis, certain pharaohs were required to embody her form. The belief was rooted in balance. Isis represented femininity, magic, and life, while Osiris, her brother and consort, symbolized death, order, and renewal. A pharaoh who ruled only as Osi, Ris was considered incomplete. To fully claim the throne, he had to demonstrate his ability to channel Isis as well, not through prayer alone, but through imitation, through transformation. This ritual, known among certain priestly circles as the unification of opposites, demanded more than symbolic gestures. It required the crossing of boundaries, physical, spiritual, and deeply personal. The pharaoh was dressed in full female attire, carefully chosen to mirror the depictions of Isis carved into temple walls. He wore a linen dress, embroidered with patterns of stars and lotus flowers. His chest was padded to create a feminine form. His arms were adorned with bangles, and his feet were painted red, a color associated with sacred femininity. His face was softened with pigment. Kohl outlined his eyes, and his lips were darkened with crushed carmine. A wig was placed over his shaved head, its black strands oiled and perfumed. The transformation was not meant to mock or entertain. It was meant to dissolve the boundary between masculine and feminine, to allow the spirit of Isis to enter and reside within the king's body. What makes this ritual so disorienting is the quiet precision with which it was performed, as though divinity required costume and enactment, not lineage alone. For a brief moment, the pharaoh became a vessel not of himself, but of the goddess he sought to embody. His own identity was suspended compared to modern expressions of gender exploration, which are often personal and voluntary. This act was mandated by spiritual duty and enforced by religious authority. A king who refused the ritual was seen as unstable, too rigid, too incomplete to maintain balance upon the throne. The crown demanded softness as much as strength. To fail in embodying both was considered dangerous. Once prepared, the pharaoh was led into a darkened chamber. There, he was not alone. A male priest, also dressed in ceremonial attire, awaited him. But this priest did not take a dominant role. Instead, he embodied Osiris. The pharaoh, now in the role of Isis, was instructed to perform a symbolic union. The act did not always involve physical contact. At times, it was expressed through dance. At others, it unfolded as a sequence of carefully choreographed gestures. Yet in some records, the union is described more directly through touch, shared breath, and intertwined posture. The chamber remained silent. A single drumbeat set the rhythm. The floor was covered in white linen, and incense thickened the air. The transformation did not end with the removal of garments. What followed was a period of quiet observation, a time in which the pharaoh was not addressed as king, nor as a god, but as something in between. Servants moved around him without meeting his eyes. Priests spoke only in gestures. Even the air inside the chamber seemed to shift, as if waiting to see what would emerge from the silence. During this interval, the pharaoh was expected to remain still, not in rest but in awareness. Every movement of his breath, every sensation across his skin was believed to carry meaning. The body, having just served as a vessel for both masculine and feminine divinity, was now in a fragile state. To speak too soon, to eat too quickly, or to show impatience was thought to disrupt the balance that had just been achieved. This pause, though rarely mentioned in temple records, was considered by some priests to be the most critical part of the ritual. It was here that the illusion either held or broke. A ruler who emerged calm, composed, and silent was seen as one who had truly absorbed the union, but one who showed discomfort, confusion, or agitation raised quiet concern among the inner circle. Outside the chamber, the palace continued its rhythm. Messenger moved through corridors. Servants prepared meals, guards changed shifts, but within the temple walls, time stretched differently. The king was no longer part of the world he ruled, not yet returned, not fully transformed. Eventually, a signal was given. A single bell, soft but clear. At that sound, the high priest stepped forward and placed a hand lightly on the pharaoh's shoulder. No words were spoken, but the meaning was understood. The transition was complete. The king could return. When he stepped out of the chamber, nothing about his appearance revealed what had taken place. He wore the same linen, the same ornaments, the same calm expression expected of a ruler. But within the palace hierarchy, something had shifted. Those who knew of the ritual adjusted their behavior in subtle ways. Their bows were slightly deeper, their voices slightly lower, not out of fear but recognition. From that moment onward, the pharaoh was no longer just a political figure or even a divine representative. He was considered a completed entity, one who had embodied duality and returned intact. This status elevated him beyond ordinary kinship. It allowed his decisions to carry not just authority, but inevitability. Yet what remains most striking is the contrast between the enormity of the transformation and the silence that followed it. No celebration marked its completion. No public acknowledgement confirmed it. The most profound change in the ruler's identity occurred entirely out of sight, witnessed only by those bound to secrecy. And perhaps that is what defined the Egyptian system more than anything else. Power was not always displayed. It was constructed in hidden spaces, through rituals that blurred the line between body and belief, identity and performance. The throne, from the outside, appeared solid, eternal, unshakable, but beneath it lay a foundation of acts, symbol, and transformations that few would ever see, and even fewer would ever understand. The air inside the chamber felt unmoving, as if it had been sealed not just from the outside world, but from time itself. Each step echoed faintly against the stone, swallowed almost immediately by the weight of silence. The pharaoh was instructed not to speak. Even breath was to be measured, slow and deliberate, as though the dead surrounding him might still be listening. At the center of the tomb lay the sarcophagus, its surface carved with scenes of journey and judgment. Figures with animal heads guided the soul through unseen paths. Offerings were etched into the stone, preserved not for the body, but for the memory of life. The lid was never opened. What rested inside was not meant to be disturbed. The ritual was not about the corpse, but about proximity to it. The priests arranged the space with precision. Small bowls of oil were placed at the corners of the chamber. Symbols were traced onto the floor using powdered minerals, forming a boundary that separated the living from what lay beyond. The pharaoh stood within that boundary, alone for a brief moment, as the priests stepped back into the shadows. This was the point where the ritual shifted from preparation to confrontation. The descent of the breath was not simply about entering a tomb. It was about acknowledging that the power of kingship did not begin with the living ruler, nor did it end with him. It flowed through generations, carried by those who had ruled before and those yet to come. To stand in that space was to stand within that current. The priests began a low chant, barely above a whisper. The words were not meant to be understood in a literal sense. They were fragments, repetitions, sounds designed to create a rhythm rather than a message. The chamber seemed to respond, the echoes layering over each other. It was difficult to tell where one voice ended and another began. The pharaoh was guided to kneel. not as a sign of submission to the priests, but as an acknowledgement of the presence he had entered. In that moment, he was no longer the highest authority. He was a participant in something older, something that did not recognize crowns or titles. What followed was described in surviving fragments not as an act, but as an offering of vitality. The living body, warm and breathing, placed in direct contrast with the stillness of death. It was believed that this contrast created a bridge, a fleeting connection through which strength could be drawn, not from the body of the dead, but from the continuity they represented. The focus was never on detail, only on intention. The pharaoh was expected to remain composed, controlled, fully aware of his role. Any sign of hesitation was noted silently by the priests. This was not a test of endurance, but of alignment. To falter here suggested a disconnect between the ruler and the lineage he claimed to embody. When the ritual reached its conclusion, the chanting stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was heavier than before, as if something unseen had shifted within the chamber. The priests approached again, this time with slow, deliberate movements. No acknowledgement was given, no confirmation spoken. The absence of interruption itself was taken as a sign that the ritual had been accepted. The pharaoh was then led out of the tomb the same way he had entered, quietly, without ceremony. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, though no one remarked on it. The lamps were extinguished behind them, sealing the space once more. Whatever had taken place inside remained there, locked within stone and memory. In the days that followed, nothing outward changed. The court continued its routines. Advisors spoke, servants moved, and the machinery of the palace carried on. But within the inner circle, the final step had been completed. The ruler had not only balanced the forces within himself, but had faced the presence of those who came before him and emerged without fracture. And in a system where continuity was everything, that mattered more than anything visible, because a king who could stand among the dead without losing himself was a king who could rule the living without fear. The rhythm was deliberate, almost restrained, as if the act itself was secondary to the presence it created. Every movement was measured, every breath intentional. The woman did not cry out. Her voice remained contained, reduced to faint exhalations that blended into the low hum of the chamber. The priests, standing at the edges, listened more than they watched. Time inside the tomb lost its structure. There was no clear beginning, no defined end, only a gradual unfolding of sensation against stillness. The stone beneath them held the cold of centuries. The air carried the weight of what had come before, and within that space the living bodies moved not for themselves, but for something unseen, something expected to answer. At intervals, one of the priests would strike a small metal object, producing a sharp, contained sound that echoed briefly before dissolving. These moments were not signals to stop or begin, but markers, acknowledgments that the boundary between silence and sound had been crossed again. The pharaoh's role remained unchanged throughout. He did not rush, did not pause unnecessarily, did not break the rhythm that had been established. His focus was not on the woman, nor on himself, but on the space around them, as if aware that the chamber itself was part of the ritual, a participant as much as any living figure present. The woman, too, remained within her role. Her stillness was not passive. It was controlled, practiced, sustained with effort. The slight tremor of muscle, the shift of breath, the tightening of her hands against the stone, all of it existed within the narrow limits allowed by the ritual. She was not meant to respond, only to sustain the conditions required. As the lamps burned lower, their flames thinning and wavering, the atmosphere in the chamber shifted almost imperceptibly. The priest's chanting, which had been absent for long stretches, returned in fragments, not continuous, not dominant, but woven between the sounds already present. The effect was subtle, creating a layered rhythm where breath, movement, and voice became difficult to separate. There was no visible sign of the ancestors. No figure emerged, no voice answered directly. And yet, within the belief system that shaped the ritual, the absence of interruption was itself meaningful. Silence was not emptiness. It was Acknowledgement. When the final lamp began to dim, the act slowed naturally, not as a command, but as a consequence of the space itself. The pharaoh withdrew without ceremony. No words were exchanged. The woman remained where she was for several moments longer, her body still, her breathing gradually returning to its natural pace. Only then did the priest step forward. They did not speak to either of them. One placed a cloth around the woman's shoulders. Another traced a symbol in the air above the pharaoh's head using oil-dipped fingers. These gestures were quiet, almost invisible, but they marked the closing of the ritual. The chamber returned to stillness. What had been disturbed was allowed to settle again. The boundary once crossed was restored. The tomb resumed its original purpose, holding silence rather than breaking it. The pharaoh was guided back toward the entrance. He did not look behind him. That, too, was part of the discipline. To turn back was to remain connected. To move forward without hesitation was to accept that the exchange, whatever its result, was complete. The woman was led away separately. Her role ended the moment the ritual closed. No acknowledgement followed, no elevation, no recorded honor. Like many others within these hidden practices, her presence was essential, but her identity remained unspoken. Above ground, the world remained unchanged. The palace stood as it had before. The river continued its course. The people carried on without knowledge of what had taken place beneath their feet, but within the hidden structure of belief that guided the throne, another step had been fulfilled. The pharaoh had entered the domain of the dead, not as a visitor, but as a participant, and had returned carrying nothing visible, yet everything required, and in a system where power depended not just on rule, but on continuity, that unseen exchange was considered enough. If the pharaoh grew tired, the priests did not intervene. If the woman's breath broke into sound, it was not silenced. Each response, each reaction, was absorbed into the ritual rather than corrected. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was stopped. When the final motion came to an end, the pharaoh lowered both hands onto the stone floor, pressing his palms flat against its cold surface, as though expecting something to rise through it. He remained there for a moment, unmoving before slowly standing. The woman did not move with him. She remained where she was, untouched, her role completed the instant the act ended. No words were spoken to her. No acknowledgement was given. In time, she was led away to another chamber, where her body was washed and her breathing allowed to settle. Sleep followed, not as comfort, but as release. Some of these women were returned to temple duties, their presence folded back into routine. Others were sent away, relocated to distant estates, their removal framed as a quiet form of reward. Their names were never written. Their involvement remained known only to those few who had stood witness. Fragments of this ritual appear in scattered tomb inscriptions. One passage reads, "He who called beneath the stone was answered." Another speaks of breath-stirring dust long at rest. A third, discovered near the Valley of the Kings, depicts two figures lying beneath a suspended eye, encircled by symbols of silence and eternity. The ceremony itself was rare. It was not part of regular practice, nor repeated without reason. It was reserved for moments of transition, when power shifted, or when signs suggested that ancestral favor had weakened. The decision never came from the pharaoh. It belonged to the priests. To request it was seen as overreach. To be chosen for it carried both weight and honor. What defines this ritual is not its form, but its meaning. It reframed physical union as something beyond pleasure or lineage. The act became a form of sound, a signal sent into darkness, into memory, into the unseen depths beneath authority itself. It was not meant to be felt. It was meant to be heard. Yet the ritual was not without risk. The air within the chamber could grow thin. The heat from the lamps could become overwhelming. Priests, despite their training, sometimes faltered. In one recorded account, a woman collapsed during the rite and did not recover. Her body was not removed. She was buried within the same tomb, wrapped in linen marked with the symbol of passage. Afterward, the pharaoh entered a period of silence. For 2 days, he fasted. He spoke to no one, not even his closest advisors. He slept alone, removed from the rhythms of the court. It was believed that in this interval, his soul remained open, susceptible to what lay beyond the visible world. Dreams, if they came, were studied. He might see those who rule before him. He might witness fragments of the afterlife, or he might experience nothing at all. Even that absence carried meaning. Silence was never dismissed. It was interpreted. Once this period ended, the ritual was considered complete. The tomb used for the desert net was sealed permanently. No one returned to it. The dust remained untouched. The objects left behind were not reclaimed, not purified, not reused. What had occurred there was not meant to be repeated. It was meant to remain, held within stone, within silence, and within the unseen structure that supported the throne itself. The memory of the rite lingered only in the echoes of breath that had once filled its chamber. Above it, the court resumed its familiar rhythm. Lamps were lit. Dancers practiced their movements. Lamps were lit. Dancers practiced their movements. Scribes bent over their scrolls, recording decisions that would shape the visible world. Yet beneath it all, something unseen had already been set in motion. Whether the call had been heard or not remained unknown. No voice answered directly. No sign confirmed success. And still, within the belief that guided the throne, the act itself was enough. Elsewhere within the temple grounds, another preparation unfolded, not in darkness below, but in elevated spaces where stone towers reached toward the sky. Here, the atmosphere shifted. The silence was different, less heavy, more controlled. What was being arranged was not a call to the past, but an exchange within the present. This union did not belong to the king alone. It belonged to those who stood close to power, those who sought not just to serve the throne, but to shape it. In these upper chambers, authority moved without announcement, without record, and without resistance. Where the tomb invoked the strength of the dead, the temple above secured the influence of the living. Among the many unspoken paths that led toward stability of rule, one remained hidden, even from most within the court. It was never declared. It appeared in no inscription, yet its presence was understood by those who operated within the highest circles of power. It required no proclamation. It required submission. Within the temple hierarchy existed figures whose roles extended far beyond ritual performance. These were not ordinary priests. They were custodians of access, interpreters of legitimacy, and guardians of transitions. Their approval shaped outcomes long before they were made visible. They spoke rarely, and when they did, their words carried layers of meaning. Their staffs bore symbols no longer taught openly. Their routines followed patterns known only within their order. Isolation defined them, but so did influence. To stand against them was to risk unraveling the delicate structure that supported the throne. When a pharaoh took power with experience and confidence, the temple affirmed his position through visible rites. But when the ruler was young, untested, or surrounded by uncertainty, the process shifted inward. What could not be secured publicly was reinforced privately. In such moments, a different ritual was prepared. It was not discussed beyond a narrow circle. It did not appear in formal accounts of coronation. Its existence was carried quietly among senior clergy and a select group of advisors who understood its necessity. They referred to it as the passing of presence. The chamber in which it occurred was hidden beneath the inner sections of the temple, separate from spaces used for ordinary worship. It was neither grand nor decorated for display. Its purpose was not to impress, but to contain. The walls were marked with faint carvings, worn by time and rarely restored. Light entered only through controlled sources, small flames placed deliberately to create shadow rather than remove it. The air was still, untouched by movement beyond the room itself. Here, power was not declared. It was transferred. The memory of the ritual did not stay written in stone or ink, but in the echoes that once filled the chamber. Above that sealed space, life in the core continued as if nothing had shifted. Servants moved quietly through corridors, lighting lamps. Dancers practiced their routines, and scribes continued documenting royal orders. Yet far beneath all of this, something unseen had been released. Whether it had been received or ignored remained unknown. Elsewhere within the temple grounds, another practice was being prepared. Unlike the hidden rites below, this one existed in elevated towers, closer to the sky than the earth. It was a different form of union, one that relied not on spoken authority but on silent exchange. The offering here did not come from the king, but from those who aimed to stand beside him. While the tomb rituals called upon the power of the dead, the structures above ground focused on securing influence among the living. This power did not emerge from ancestral spirits, but from the presence and authority of the priesthood. Among the many unspoken paths toward influence, there existed one that was never formally acknowledged. It required no proclamation, no written decree. It demanded only submission. Within the higher ranks of the temple lived priests who controlled more than rituals. They controlled access. Their approval shaped coronations, validated wars, and confirmed divine favor. Their authority was subtle yet absolute. When a ruler ascended the throne with strength and preparation, public ceremonies were enough. But when the heir was young or uncertain, a different approach was taken. This private process, known only within select circles, was referred to as the passing of presence. It occurred in a secluded chamber, hidden beneath the temple. The room was dim, illuminated by a single oil lamp, casting long shadows. The young ruler, recently declared but not fully accepted, entered under strict silence after fasting and preparation. Inside waited an elder priest, one believed to carry accumulated spiritual force. His role extended beyond guidance. Through a deeply physical interaction, authority itself was believed to transfer. The ruler did not command here. He yielded. The act was neither cruel nor comforting. It existed only to complete what was seen as an essential cycle. Unlike modern systems that rely on lineage or law, this belief required something more direct. Authority had to be activated. The ruler received, the priest gave. No witnesses stood by. No records were openly kept. Only the two participants and the fading flame marked the moment. When it ended, the priest placed a hand upon the ruler's chest and spoke a quiet line. The lamp was extinguished. The ruler rose, clothed himself, and moved forward into the next stage of public recognition. The act was never repeated. Afterward, the priest withdrew from visibility. He returned to isolation, leaving behind influence that lingered quietly in decisions, in hesitation, in dreams shared with advisors. To those within the temple, this was not seen as exploitation, but as necessity. Power, like a substance, required a vessel. Outside the chamber, whispers spread but never formed into open words. Observers noticed changes. Silence became heavier. Certain priests gained quiet importance, yet no one questioned openly. To challenge the ritual was to challenge the foundation itself. Over time, the practice faded. Shifts in dynasties and beliefs altered the structure, but traces remained hid on carvings and coded symbols. Those who had experienced it carried its memory not in words, but in presence. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, a very different form of ritual took shape. Unlike the hidden exchanges of authority, these were visible, structured, and centered on demonstration rather than secrecy. Women gathered not to confirm rule, but to display fertility. Within carefully concealed structures at the edge of inner courts, new ceremonial spaces appeared. These were not traditional sanctuaries. They were designed with a singular purpose, blending physical presence with spiritual intention. Some were never officially recorded, others were described vaguely, their true purpose known only to a few. Their design reflected this secrecy. Unlike vast halls, these chambers were enclosed, intimate, and shielded from all outside view. Entryways were hidden behind complex passages or concealed doors. Inside, the atmosphere changed entirely. Smooth, black stone floors replaced rough surfaces. Warm pools infused with herbs were carved into the ground. Walls displayed stars and floral patterns rather than gods or battles. The space itself became part of the ritual. Every element, light, scent, temperature, was arranged with precision. Participants were chosen in advance. Preparation involved cleansing, silence, and controlled presentation. Words were limited. Movement was intentional. The act, often referred to as divine blending, was believed to connect the physical with the celestial. Each motion followed a sequence tied to cosmic patterns. Each gesture echoed a line from ancient teachings. The moment of culmination symbolized union beyond the physical. What stands out is not the act itself, but the environment surrounding it. The chamber functioned as a vessel. The body became a medium. Desire, often seen as instinct, was reframed as something structured, and elevated. The ruler was expected to transform within this space. There were no traditional comforts, no beds, no coverings. Only stone, water, and oil. The experience required adaptation, both physical and mental. Those who maintained these chambers worked silently. They prepared the space, cleansed it afterward, and ensured its readiness. But they never witnessed the act. The sanctity came from absence as much as presence. Only a select number of temples contained such rooms. They were often positioned near the innermost sanctum, sometimes separated from sacred statues by only a thin barrier. This placement was intentional. It was believed that energy, sound, and heat could pass through and awaken divine presence. Over time, these chambers developed reputations. Some were believed to bring fertility. Others were said to restore strength or clarity. Stories circulated, but details remained hidden. For rulers, these spaces offered something rare: privacy without consequence. A place where roles could shift, where control could be released. Some chose stillness, others guided the process, but the purpose remained unchanged: alignment. What remains most striking is the reliance on silence and structure. These chambers did not record history, yet they held it. Every movement, every breath left a trace. The stone absorbed what words never did, and despite their significance, no detailed records survive. The rituals were not meant to be read. They were meant to be experienced and then forgotten. Nothing was written. Only fragments of this practice surfaced over time. A line in a temple hymn spoke of two lights meeting in darkness. A symbol carved near a water basin showed what looked like joined hands between a mortal and something greater. These traces remained as suggestions, never confirmations. In rare instances, travelers and foreign scribes mentioned whispers about hidden royal chambers, but their words were dismissed as imagination or distortion. Yet the repetition of these accounts across generations hinted at something deeper. These were not isolated stories. They were echoes carried forward by those who chose to speak. As new beliefs emerged and older temples fell into disuse, many of these spaces were sealed. Some were buried beneath sand, others hidden behind later constructions. A few may still remain beneath ruins, holding traces of what once occurred within them. While these hidden spaces explored the connection between the physical and the divine in secrecy, another tradition developed within the palace itself. This time the focus shifted. It was no longer centered on rulers or priests alone, but on queens and the unique form of power they carried. As physical rituals became less frequent, new methods of preserving intention emerged. The Egyptians turned to objects that could travel beyond death, objects capable of holding memory, identity, and desire. Among these, the coffin became more than protection for the body. It became a surface for expression. Most coffins followed tradition, decorated with protective imagery and sacred texts. But some displayed something different. Instead of only symbols and prayers, they contained scenes of human connection, carefully illustrated and hidden from immediate view. These images were often placed inside, visible only once the coffin was opened. One example from a later period showed a reclining female figure, surrounded by floral elements, with another figure positioned closely beside her. Above them, symbols associated with rebirth and continuity appeared. Early interpretations suggested divine representation, but details indicated something more personal. The figure wore ornaments typical of nobility, and her features resembled known portrait styles. This was not purely symbolic. It reflected an individual identity. For the Egyptians, the afterlife was not separation, but continuation. Just as tombs were filled with food and tools, they were also prepared with imagery meant to guide and sustain the soul. These scenes were not considered improper. They were intentional, created with purpose. Artists responsible for such work were carefully selected. They underwent purification rituals before beginning. They worked under controlled conditions, using limited light and natural materials. Their focus was precision, capturing form, movement, and connection without exaggeration. The goal was not to provoke, but to represent continuity. Placement of these images followed a structured logic. They were positioned where they would be seen first upon awakening, aligned with other symbolic elements within the burial. Every detail, from composition to location, carried meaning. Externally, coffins maintained traditional appearance. They had to be acceptable to those present during burial rites, but internally, they reflected the beliefs of the individual. Once sealed, the coffin belonged to the deceased alone. Some families were aware of these additions and accepted them quietly. Others chose not to acknowledge them. In certain cases, such requests were arranged privately through trusted intermediaries. Agreements were informal, handled discreetly. What stands out is the tone of these representations. They were calm, composed, and balanced. Surroundings often included natural elements, flowers, fruits, flowing fabric. The intention was not to disturb, but to provide familiarity. These images were believed to offer direction. As the soul moved through unknown spaces, it would recall warmth, closeness, and connection. The imagery served as a reminder that existence continued beyond the physical. Additional objects were sometimes included within tombs, placed near specific areas of the body. These items carried symbolic meaning tied to renewal and continuity. They were simple in design, without inscriptions, yet deliberate in placement. Over time, as external influences reshaped beliefs, many of these elements were altered or concealed. Later observers sometimes misunderstood their purpose. However, continued study revealed patterns that pointed to intentional design. Today, only limited examples remain intact. Some are preserved in collections, while others exist only through records and sketches. They provide a glimpse into a system where physical and spiritual ideas were deeply intertwined. Beyond these visual preparations, another practice emerged, more direct and internal. Some individuals chose not to rely solely on external symbols. Instead, they incorporated meaning within their own bodies. Archaeological findings have revealed cases where small crafted objects were placed within female mummies. These were not accidental. Their positioning and design indicate careful intention. They were created from various materials and shaped with consistency. Initially, such discoveries caused confusion, but repeated findings across different regions confirmed a pattern. This practice appeared specific to certain groups, particularly those of higher status. Unlike external adornments, these objects were hidden, meant to accompany the individual beyond physical form. Their presence suggests a belief in preparedness, not only in a spiritual sense, but in a more complete state of being. For these individuals, the afterlife required readiness in multiple forms. It was not only about judgment or purity, but about continuation. What was carried within life extended into what came after. Researchers studying these findings noted the precision of placement. It was not random or careless. Each instance reflected intention, following a pattern that was repeated across time. No equivalent practices have been found in male burials, indicating a distinction in how roles and symbolism were assigned. The focus remained specific, connected to beliefs about continuity, identity, and transformation. These discoveries continue to raise questions. They point toward a complex system of belief, where the boundary between body and spirit was not fixed, but fluid. Others had simpler coffins, yet their surrounding offerings were arranged with care, and all shared the same concealed charm within. In a modern view, this might appear intrusive or controversial, but within ancient Egypt, it carried a different meaning. It was understood as a way to preserve the feminine essence in its most potent state. Sexuality was not reduced to pleasure alone. It was seen as a force, a pathway, a connection between the human and the divine. Some scholars connect these internal amulets to the story of Isis and Osiris. After Osiris was destroyed, Isis restored his form and brought him back through an act tied to creation itself. From that union came Horus. In this narrative, the ability to receive and hold divine essence was central. It symbolized renewal. For women in death, carrying such a symbol may have represented readiness for rebirth. Certain temple inscriptions hint at similar ideas. One passage speaks of a goddess reminding a queen that her body must remain receptive even in stillness. Another references a guarded passage described as a gate kept active through unseen forces. Though these references are indirect, they suggest a belief system where the female body retains significance beyond life. The form of these objects also held meaning. They were crafted with smooth surfaces, sometimes marked with traces of color associated with vitality. Others took abstract shapes, resembling natural forms like flame or blooming petals. These were not literal representations but symbols of potential and transition. The individuals responsible for placing these objects likely worked discreetly. The process was not part of standard burial procedures. It may have been carried out during the final stages before sealing, when fewer witnesses were present. The object would be wrapped carefully, then placed with intention. The wrapping served both practical and symbolic purposes. These items were not described in formal burial guides or displayed in tomb imagery. They remained private, chosen either by the individual or arranged by close attendants. In some cases, additional small items or markings were included nearby, but most remained simple and unmarked. What stands out is the awareness behind the choice. To be prepared for death while still holding a symbol of continuity suggests a deliberate perspective. The individual was not defined solely by status or lineage, but by a desire to carry a sense of completeness forward. Modern interpretations have varied. Some institutions avoid displaying such findings, while others categorize them broadly. That presence across multiple discoveries indicates intention rather than accident. These were not random inclusions, but deliberate placements with meaning. There is no clear indication that these objects were considered improper. Their concealment appears linked not to shame, but to their significance. Like many practices of that time, they were kept hidden to preserve their purpose. With advancements in research methods, these features have been identified without disturbing the remains. In one instance, multiple objects were found arranged in a specific pattern within a single individual. The exact meaning remains uncertain, but the arrangement suggests careful design, as these practices reveal the depth of belief surrounding the body and its role beyond life. They also show how far such ideas could extend. In some cases, attention shifted beyond the individual to the figure of the ruler himself. Certain ceremonies existed that were rarely documented. Some were spoken of only in fragments, passed quietly between generations. One such ritual was associated with restoring energy to a sacred presence when it was believed to have diminished. Preparation for such an event involved isolation. Selected individuals were separated for several days, following strict routines of diet and cleansing. Communication was limited. The full purpose was known only to a few within the temple hierarchy. At the appointed time, participants were brought into a controlled environment. The space was designed with intention, including temperature, lighting, and structure. Movement and behavior followed specific patterns, guided by instruction rather than impulse. The central idea was that collective human energy could influence a greater force. Actions were synchronized, measured, and observed. Those overseeing the process documented its progression carefully, noting details that might indicate success or failure. Participants who could not continue were removed without disruption and allowed to rest nearby. This was not seen as failure, but as a different form of response. The overall process continued until the designated completion. Afterward, the space was restored. Participants were guided out, given time to recover, and instructed to remain silent about their experience. The ritual was not discussed openly, maintaining its position within a closed system. Interpretations of such practices vary. Some view them as methods of control, others as attempts to influence unseen forces. For those involved, the experience itself held meaning, whether through belief, environment, or shared participation. Over time, these practices diminished as beliefs shifted, yet traces remained in later traditions, appearing in altered forms. Their legacy exists in fragments, part memory, part interpretation. The relationship between physical experience and symbolic meaning continued to evolve. In some cases, this led to practices that combined both in more visible ways. They were rituals that brought together authority, expectation, and purpose in a structured setting. One such example involved the role of the queen and the continuation of lineage. When natural processes failed to produce an heir, alternative methods were sometimes introduced under ritual context. These were not viewed simply as personal acts, but as actions tied to responsibility and continuation. The intention behind such practices was defined by necessity. The outcome was expected to serve a larger purpose, ensuring stability and continuity within the ruling structure. The substance was treated not as metaphor, but as material reality. Whether viewed as literal or symbolic, its role within the ritual system remained the same. It represented continuity, power, and the belief that divine essence could be stored, transferred, and reawakened when needed. The priests who handled these jars did so with extreme care. Their hands were washed repeatedly, their bodies purified before contact, and their minds trained to avoid distraction. This was not a task given to novices. It required discipline, silence, and unwavering belief. What stands out most is how something so private was elevated into something institutional. The line between body and state blurred completely. The pharaoh's essence was no longer confined to his living form. It was divided, preserved, and distributed across spaces meant to sustain both earthly rule and spiritual continuity. The jars became extensions of the king himself, silent witnesses to rituals that sought to preserve order beyond a single lifetime. Over time, as beliefs shifted and outside influences grew stronger, these practices began to fade. Some jars were lost, others hidden, and a few deliberately destroyed. What remains today are fragments, references scattered across temple ruins, and partial texts that hint at a system once deeply embedded in royal life. They suggest a world where nothing was too intimate to be ritualized, nothing too personal to be turned into doctrine. And yet, even as these practices disappeared, the ideas behind them lingered. The belief that power could be stored, transferred, and reborn did not vanish. It simply changed form, adapting to new structures, new symbols, and new understandings of divinity. The jars, whether real or symbolic, became part of a larger pattern, one where the body itself was never just flesh, but a medium through which eternity was imagined, shaped, and pursued. And the reverence with which the jars were handled suggested the belief was not just symbolic. In later dynasties, some jars began including not only semen but also hair clippings, nail fragments, and blood droplets from the pharaoh. These additions were thought to concentrate his power. There was a brief period when some jars were blessed and given as amulets to temple dancers or priestesses, a dangerous mingling of ritual and daily life that was eventually banned. Reading about these rituals, I find myself equally fascinated and disturbed. The degree to which bodily fluids were ritualized says as much about their theology as it does about their understanding of power. Even today, in museum archives across Europe and Egypt, curators occasionally discover small jars with inscriptions indicating such sacred uses. Their contents have long since dried or been lost, but their purpose is still evident in the markings. Some are stored in special rooms, rarely displayed to the public, not because of shame, but because few would understand what they are seeing. The pharaoh was not just a ruler of men, but a ruler of meaning. His body, his desires, and his essence were all tools of the state, directed not by whim, but by religious expectations, centuries in the making. And even after death, his physical remains were managed like state property. What's more astonishing is how these ideas extended beyond the pharaoh. In the next part, we look at how some royal daughters were trained from early childhood to participate in similar rituals, not as passive figures, but as active preservers of the divine cycle. Tucked deep inside sealed temple chambers and private archives, there existed a type of papyrus that few eyes were ever meant to see. These were not royal decrees or lists of grain offerings. These were instructional scrolls, hand-drawn in ink, made from soot and wine. They depicted human bodies entangled in precise acts of intercourse. Unlike the stylized depictions found in tomb or temple murals, these illustrations were uncomfortably realistic, limbs curved with tension. Expressions of pleasure were deliberately captured, positions were varied, and many scenes were accompanied by annotations describing motion, rhythm, and purpose. These scrolls were part of a body of knowledge known as ritual erotica. In the context of Ayant, Egyptian beliefs, sex was not merely for procreation or pleasure. It was a tool of divine alignment, a mechanism to restore cosmic balance, and sometimes a medical solution among couples who could not conceive, especially those of noble or priestly class. These scrolls were brought out not for entertainment, but for instruction. The acts shown were believed to replicate the original unions between gods and goddesses by mimicking them exactly. Couples could supposedly unlock blocked fertility channels or realign their energies with sacred rhythms. Only high priests and priestesses were allowed to handle these scrolls. They were stored in locked wooden cabinets, usually painted black and marked with hieroglyphs that warned of desecration. The penalty for a commoner glimpsing one of these drawings was severe. Even palace guards who transported the scrolls had to keep their eyes down and their hands gloved. This secrecy was not because the scrolls were considered shameful, but because they were considered powerful. The idea was that only the spiritually prepared could endure their energy without harm. Most scrolls were brought out during a ritual known as the alignment of the flame, performed on certain moonless nights. During the ceremony, barren couples were taken into a specially prepared chamber. The room was cleansed with smoke, lit with flickering oil lamps, and adorned with painted symbols of lotus, ankh, and scarab. The scrolls were then unrolled by a temple attendant and placed on a stone table. The couple would view them while receiving whispered instructions from a priestess, trained in both healing and technique. In some variations of the ritual, couples were expected to perform one or more of the depicted acts in the presence of the priestess. This was not voyeurism. It was a correction. Just as a healer would guide a patient through physical therapy, the priestess would observe and make gentle adjustments, a shift of the hip, a slowing of the breath, a touch relocated by inches. The belief was that improper technique could block the flow of life energy, while properly aligned bodies would invite conception as a natural consequence. These teachings extended beyond infertile couples. In temples dedicated to Hathor or Isis, selected temple dancers were also taught using these scrolls. The goal was not seduction, but resonance. Their movements were choreographed to echo the sacred unions, forming a kind of living sculpture of fertility. During certain public festivals, these dancers would perform symbolic movements drawn from the scrolls, though no one in the crowd knew the full meaning behind the gestures. What shocks modern readers is not simply the presence of erotic material, but the clinical detail. Positions were drawn from multiple angles. Notes included recommended durations, breathing patterns, and even dietary guidelines for the days leading up to ritual intercourse. Some scrolls suggested specific times of day and moon phases for each act. Others warned against excessive passion, claiming it could deplete the man's divine energy or confuse the womb. Over the centuries, some scrolls were lost, damaged by fire or theft. Others were intentionally destroyed during periods of moral reform when later dynasties sought to erase what they saw as indulgent or outdated. But a few survived. In recent decades, fragments have surfaced in archaeological digs, mostly near Thebes and Saqqara. Museums often classify them under coded categories like domestic life or medicinal illustration. Yet the context, once decoded, leaves little doubt about their purpose. For modern Egyptologists, these scrolls are challenging to interpret, not because they are ambiguous, but because the modern lens sees eroticism as private, while ancient one saw it as divine choreography. What we might blush at, the ancients might have knelt before. What they feared, improper technique, misaligned bodies, sterile unions, we often dismiss as superstition. But for them, sex was not just a biological act. It was a prayer made with the body, and each movement was a line in that prayer. I find it strangely grounding that such rituals existed. It reminds me that throughout history, people have always tried to bring order to the mysteries of life in ways that reflect their time, their fears, and their hopes. The gods who once stood outside those ritual chambers are long gone. The couples who stared at those scrolls by lamplight never knew their most intimate moments would one day be discussed in academic circles. The scribes who drew those curved limbs and open mouths could not have imagined tourists peering at their work through museum glass. And yet here we are, still wondering what it all meant, still shocked by how far belief could carry the body. The story of ancient Egyptian sexuality is not just about strange practices. It is about how every part of human life, even the most private, was turned into a tool of power, worship, and healing. Pharaohs offered their bodies to the gods. Priestesses directed intimacy with the precision of a mathematician. And couples, desperate for a child, were told to follow instructions no one else was allowed to see. So we end here where ink met skin, where ritual met desire, where temples guarded not just treasure, but knowledge too strange for the public. It is a reminder that in the ancient world, no boundary between sacred and physical was truly fixed. Everything touched everything else. Tonight, close your eyes not just on a strange history, but on the quiet truth behind it, that even in a world ruled by gods and gold, it was still human longing that shaped the rituals we now find so unusual. Sleep well, and may your dreams be a little stranger tonight.